And in the case of Robert Menzies, I was struck by his post-war economic context. The prevailing economic context was distinctly Keynesian, something he did not seek to challenge in any meaningful way. He was not a disciple of Hayek or Friedman or Rand. Indeed, the cold abstractions of the free market ideologues today would be alien to him. Nor was he a great economic reformer like John Howard. Instead, he continued much of the economic project that had been established by Chifley before him. That is not to say that Menzies wholeheartedly embraced Keynes and big government. On the contrary, it was Prime Minister Chifley's plan to nationalise Australia's trading banks where we see Menzies' economic instincts on full display. He picked and won the battle that mattered most. The 1949 election victory settled the question of how Australia's economy would grow in the coming decades. Under Menzies, it would be the market economy rather than the socialist state guiding our development. The Australian people voted for his vision of prosperity built on individual liberty, free enterprise and hard work, and he banished the shadow of socialism for generations to come in that election victory. But Menzies did not believe in unfettered markets. He believed in good government as a necessary partner to a thriving market economy. As Tom Switzer argues persuasively in his chapter, Liberalism Applied, Menzies, and I quote, opposed a socialist state that wanted to control society, but he was not a proponent of a dynamic free market economy. Switzer quotes Menzies directly during his time in opposition in the 40s, and I quote Menzies here, "Individual enterprise must drive us forward. This does not mean that we are to return to the old and selfish notions of laissez-faire. The functions of the state will be much more than merely keeping the ring within which the competitors will fight. Our social and industrial obligations will be increased. There will be more law, not less, more control, not less. But what really happens will depend on how many people we have who are of the great and sober and dynamic middle class, the strivers, the planners, the ambitious ones." Menzies was more paternalistic than I'd imagined after reading this collection of essays. And David Lee's chapter on Menzies and economic management makes this very clear in his embrace of the Keynesian macroeconomic assumptions, his appointments of Chifley's public servants in 1949, and his continuation, not deconstruction, of Curtin and Chifley's economic policies. He left in place the post-Federation pillars of centralised wage fixing and high tariffs, the enlarged welfare state, the demand management philosophy at Treasury, and nation-building development projects like the Snowy River Scheme. The National Development Portfolio, led by Richard Casey, underscored this development ethos with its focus on fuel security, port infrastructure, mines and manufacturing. William Stoltz's excellent chapter on the founding of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service shows the strategic imperatives that drove economic development under Menzies. In it, we learn that Casey was lobbied by the founder of the CIA, Bill Donovan, to develop the Blair Athol coal reserves in Queensland, to provide a secure supply of coal to the growing Japanese economy, thus keeping post-war Japan out of the clutches of China and Russia. Geopolitics and statecraft, rather than economics, seemed to drive some of the economic development in those early years of his prime ministership. Indeed, I would argue Menzies was no proto-Thatcher or Reagan, taking power with a supply-side handbook of economic reforms under one arm. On the contrary, the 1951 budget was a case in point. Menzies and his treasurer Arthur Fadden had to tackle inflation. They sought to dampen aggregate demand with aggressive increases on income and company taxes. And this wasn't necessarily an approach to win hearts and minds. But wait for it, there were also indirect taxes on non-essential goods, including excise on beer, wine, tobacco, spirits and cigarettes. With that, even the Labor opposition launched an attack on the budget. It was straight out of the Keynes playbook. And I wasn't surprised, therefore, to read that some true-believing young Liberal members of Parliament, elected in 1949 and committed to pure economic liberalism, were despondent with the lack of reform, with the Sydney Morning Herald relating how the backbenchers were dismayed as they watched, and I quote, party principle after party principle placed in cold storage or thrown overboard.